You have built a carefully constructed sense of who you are, assembled from your achievements and your roles and your beliefs and your preferences and your history. Created identity that feels solid and continuous and real, that provides sense of knowing yourself and being recognizable to others. This identity is what you call yourself, is a collection of attributes and qualities and characteristics that you believe define you, that distinguish you from others, that make you the particular person you have become rather than anyone else. But this identity that feels like foundation is actually prison, is cage you have constructed around yourself, is limitation you mistake for self, is collection of boundaries and restrictions that prevent you from being anything other than what you have decided you are. The ego, Jung's term for this constructed sense of self, is not who you actually are, but is who you believe you must be, is performance you maintain so consistently that you have forgotten it, is performance, is role you have inhabited so completely that you mistake the role for the reality beneath it. The trap of identity is that you experience it as liberation, as knowing yourself, as having clear sense of who you are, when actually it is imprisonment, is systematic limitation of your possibilities, is refusal to be anything that contradicts the image you have constructed. You cannot do what contradicts your identity, cannot be who you have not been, cannot change in fundamental ways, because change would threaten the continuity of self that ego exists to maintain. Understanding why your ego is your greatest jailer requires examining how identity is constructed, what it prevents, how it is defended, and what exists beyond its boundaries. The ego begins as necessary adaptation, as child's developing sense of being separate individual with particular characteristics and preferences, as organization of experience into coherent narrative about who you are. This is normal developmental achievement, is capacity to say I and to distinguish self from other, to recognize yourself as a continuous entity that persists across time, rather than as collection of disconnected moments without unifying identity. But what begins as developmental achievement becomes psychological prison because the ego cannot tolerate being anything other than what it has decided it is, requires consistency even when consistency means refusing growth, demands continuity even when continuity means remaining trapped in patterns that no longer serve. You construct identity around being a certain kind of person, and then you must be that person, regardless of whether being that person actually serves your well-being or allows authentic living. The identity is built from identifications. I am a successful person. I am intellectual. I am someone who does not need others. I am victim of circumstances. I am strong. I am damaged. I am creative. I am rational. I am spiritual. Each identification is decision about what you are that simultaneously defines what you are not, creates inclusion and exclusion, establishes boundaries that limit what you can be or do or become without threatening the identity you have constructed. The trap is that these identifications feel like discoveries rather than constructions, feel like you are recognizing who you actually are rather than deciding who you will allow yourself to be. But they are always choices, always limitations, always refusals to be anything that contradicts the chosen identity. The person who identifies as intellectual cannot allow themselves to be foolish, or to not understand, or to engage in activities that feel beneath their intelligence. The person who identifies as strong cannot allow themselves to be weak, or to need help, or to acknowledge vulnerability that contradicts the strength identity. These refusals create the prison. You cannot be anything that threatens the ego's sense of itself, cannot change in ways that would require abandoning the identity you have built, cannot allow experiences or feelings or behaviors that contradict who you have decided you are. The ego becomes jailer that prevents you from being anything other than what you have been, that punishes deviation from established identity, that maintains the prison through constant surveillance and correction of anything that might escape the boundaries it has established. The ego maintains the prison through elaborate defense mechanisms that protect identity from anything that might threaten or contradict it, that ensure you remain who you have been, rather than allowing change that would destabilize the sense of continuous self. These defenses operate automatically, beneath conscious awareness, are experienced not as defenses but as accurate perceptions of reality, as legitimate responses to threats that are actually threats to the ego's continuity rather than threats to your actual well-being. Denial allows you to not see what contradicts your identity, to filter reality so that only information confirming who you believe you are gets through, while information that would challenge the identity is literally not perceived. The person who identifies as good cannot see their own cruelty. The person who identifies as victim cannot recognize their own power. The person who identifies as independent cannot acknowledge their desperate need for connection. Rationalization transforms behaviors that contradict identity into behaviors that confirm it, provides explanations that preserve the ego's image even when actions clearly violate it. You were not cruel, you were being honest. You were not weak, you were being strategic. You were not selfish, you were practicing necessary self-care. The rationalization allows you to do what contradicts identity while maintaining belief that you are still who you have always been. Projection places onto others what cannot be acknowledged in yourself, allows you to see in them what would threaten your identity if recognized internally. The person who cannot acknowledge their own anger sees everyone else as angry. The person who cannot accept their own weakness sees others as weak. The person who denies their own manipulation recognizes it constantly in others. The projection maintains identity through externalizing what cannot be integrated without threatening the ego's sense of itself. These defenses create prison within the prison, ensure that not only can you not be anything other than what you have been, but you cannot even see the ways you already are. Things that contradict your identity cannot recognize the complexity and contradiction that actual human beings contain, because recognizing it would shatter the simple coherent identity that ego exists to maintain. You are trapped not only by what you will not allow yourself to become, but by what you will not allow yourself to see that you already are. The ego's greatest fear is annihilation, is experiencing itself as not existing, is facing that the identity it has constructed might not be real, or might not be necessary, or might be replaced with something fundamentally different. This fear creates most powerful aspect of the prison, the terror of change, the resistance to growth, the refusal to allow any transformation that would require ego death. That would mean becoming someone so different that continuity with past self cannot be maintained. This fear manifests as clinging to familiar identity even when that identity creates suffering, as preferring known misery to unknown possibility, as choosing to remain who you have been, rather than risking becoming someone you cannot predict or control. The person with identity built around being victim cannot allow themselves to become powerful because power would mean death of victim identity, would require experiencing themselves as fundamentally different, would threaten the continuity that ego exists to preserve. The fear also prevents acknowledging aspects of yourself that contradict established identity, creates the shadow that Jung described as containing everything ego cannot integrate, everything that is incompatible with who you have decided to be. The strong person's shadow contains their weakness. The kind person's shadow contains their cruelty. The rational person's shadow contains their irrationality. These qualities exist, are active, shape behavior, but cannot be consciously owned, because owning them would require fundamental revision of identity that ego experiences as existential threat. The trap is that this clinging to identity prevents the very growth and transformation that would reduce suffering and allow authentic living, ensures that you remain trapped in patterns that no longer serve, because changing the patterns would require changing the identity, creates a situation where the ego that is supposed to serve you by providing stable sense of self actually imprisons you by refusing to allow that self to change in response to new understanding or circumstances or possibilities. The fear of ego death is therefore central mechanism through which identity becomes prison, is what prevents you from allowing natural growth and transformation, is what makes you choose continuity over authenticity, is what ensures you remain who you have been, even when who you have been is no longer who you want to be or who you need to be to live well. The ego creates prison through identification with roles that define what you must do and who you must be, in ways that prevent authentic response to actual situations, that replace genuine engagement with scripted performance of what the role requires. You are not person encountering other person, but are parent encountering child, are professional encountering client, are victim encountering perpetrator, and these role identifications determine your behavior more than the actual circumstances or the actual people involved. The roles provide structure and predictability but cost you flexibility and authenticity, create situations where you must perform the role even when the role does not fit the circumstances, even when authentic response would be more appropriate, even when the role requires you to betray your actual feelings or needs or perceptions. The parent role requires being patient and nurturing even when you are exhausted and need care yourself. The professional role requires maintaining boundaries and competence even when you are confused and could benefit from vulnerability. These role identifications also create dependencies on others playing complementary roles, create need for others to be what your role requires them to be, rather than allowing them to be who they actually are. The person identified as helper needs others to be helpless. The person identified as strong needs others to be weak. The person identified as victim needs others to be perpetrators. When others do not play their assigned roles, when they change or grow or reveal complexity that does not fit the script, your identity is threatened, and you must either force them back into the role or update your own identity, which ego resists. The trap is that these role identifications feel like who you are, rather than like performances you are giving, feel like authentic self-expression, rather than like limitation and script. You cannot see that you are playing role because you have become the role, have inhabited it so completely that you experience its requirements as your own desires, its limitations as your natural boundaries, its scripts as your authentic responses. The prison of role identification is therefore among the most complete because it is most invisible, because you do not experience yourself as constrained by the role, but as simply being yourself, never recognizing that the self you are being is construction, is performance, is limitation that prevents you from responding authentically to the infinite complexity of actual life that cannot be reduced to simple roles and scripts. The ego maintains prison through attachment to consistency, through need to be today who you were yesterday, to maintain stable identity across time, regardless of whether that identity serves current circumstances or reflects current understanding or allows current growth. This attachment creates tyranny of the past, makes who you have been determine who you can be, transforms history into destiny, ensures that choices you made years ago when you were a different person in different circumstances continue to determine your life long after they have ceased to be relevant or beneficial. The consistency requirement prevents you from changing your mind without experiencing it as personal failure, prevents you from growing beyond past positions without feeling you are betraying who you were, prevents you from acknowledging you were wrong without experiencing it as threatening to core identity. The ego would rather be consistently wrong than admit error, would rather maintain outdated position than update based on new information, would rather sacrifice well-being than sacrifice consistency. This creates trap where growth itself becomes threat, where learning and development and transformation are experienced as dangers to identity rather than as natural processes of living, where becoming wiser or more capable or more integrated requires ego death that feels intolerable. You cannot allow yourself to become fundamentally different person because that would mean the person you have been no longer exists, would mean you were wrong about who you were, would mean the identity you constructed was not actually who you are, but was temporary construction that is no longer necessary or appropriate. The attachment to consistency also creates pressure to continue patterns that no longer serve simply because you have established them, to maintain relationships that have become toxic because ending them would contradict your identity as a loyal person, to pursue goals that no longer interest you because abandoning them would mean you were wrong when you set them. The past becomes prison that determines the present. Old decisions continue to control current life. Who you were prevents you from becoming who you could be. The trap is complete because consistency feels like integrity, feels like being authentic and true to yourself, when actually it is refusal to grow, is choosing past self over present possibility, is allowing who you were to imprison who you might become. The ego convinces you that changing is betrayal, when actually refusing to change is the real betrayal, is betraying your current self in service of maintaining continuity with past self who no longer exists. The ego creates prison through its need for validation and recognition from others, through organizing itself around being seen and acknowledged in particular ways, through making your sense of self dependent on others' perceptions and responses rather than on internal ground. This creates a situation where you cannot be anything that would not be recognized or validated by others, where you must perform identity that gains approval rather than living authentically, where who you are becomes what others need or expect you to be rather than what emerges from your actual nature. This dependency on external validation makes you prisoner of others' opinions and expectations, makes you unable to change if change would mean losing approval, makes you maintain identity that gains recognition, even when that identity does not reflect who you actually are or who you want to become. The person whose identity depends on being seen as successful cannot allow themselves to fail or to pursue things they might not excel at. The person whose identity depends on being seen as good cannot acknowledge their darkness or their selfishness or their capacity for harm. The trap is that this external orientation feels like social connection and belonging, when actually it is imprisonment, is systematic limitation of yourself to only what others can recognize and approve, is refusal to be anything that would risk rejection or misunderstanding or loss of the validation that ego has come to depend on. You cannot be your full self, because your full self includes aspects that others might not validate, might not understand, might reject or condemn, or simply fail to recognize. This dependency also creates vulnerability, where changes in how others see you become existential threats, where criticism or rejection or even neutral response threatens the identity that depends on being seen in particular ways. The ego that needs to be seen as intelligent is devastated by evidence of stupidity. The ego that needs to be seen as strong is shattered by exposure of weakness. The ego that needs to be seen as good cannot tolerate recognition of cruelty. The prison of needing validation is therefore one of the most restrictive because it makes your identity dependent on forces you cannot control, makes who you can be determined by what others can see and approve, ensures that you remain trapped in performance of acceptable self, while actual self remains hidden and unknown and unexpressed. The deepest trap of identity is that ego convinces you that losing it would mean losing yourself, that abandoning constructed identity would leave you with nothing, that ego death would be actual death rather than liberation. This fear prevents you from seeing that what exists beyond ego is not void but is more authentic and more complete version of yourself, is what Jung called the self, is who you actually are, beneath the constructions and performances and limitations that ego has created. The ego is not you, but is your idea of you, is collection of identifications and roles and narratives that you have mistaken for actual self, is prison you have built so carefully that you believe dismantling it would mean annihilation. But the dismantling reveals rather than destroys, shows you who you are when you are not performing identity, allows you to respond authentically to life rather than responding according to scripts that ego has written. The liberation from ego prison requires recognizing identity as construction rather than discovery, seeing the defenses that maintain it, facing the fear of change that keeps you trapped, acknowledging the roles you perform, releasing attachment to consistency, developing internal validation rather than depending on external recognition. It requires willingness to experience ego death, to allow identity to dissolve, to discover what remains when the constructions are released. This is terrifying work because ego is all you have known, because dismantling it feels like death, because you do not know who you will be without the identity you have spent lifetime building. But the alternative is remaining imprisoned, is living according to limitations that are not actually yours, is performing self rather than being self, is choosing the safety of known identity over the freedom and authenticity of living beyond ego's boundaries. Conclusion: the ego that feels like self is actually prison, is collection of identifications and roles and defenses and needs that limit rather than liberate, that trap rather than free. It is constructed through childhood as necessary development but becomes limitation in adulthood, is maintained through denial and rationalization and projection, is protected through fear of ego death, is reinforced through role identification and attachment to consistency and need for external validation. The trap is complete because identity feels like foundation when it is actually cage, feels like knowing yourself when it is actually limiting yourself, feels like being authentic when it is actually performing. You experience the prison as freedom because you have been in it so long that you cannot imagine existence outside its walls, cannot conceive of self that is not defined by the boundaries ego has established. Liberation requires recognizing ego as construction, seeing how it limits and imprisons, facing fear of change and ego death, releasing roles and consistency demands and external validation needs. It requires willingness to not know who you are, to allow identity to dissolve, to discover what exists beyond the boundaries you have mistaken for your actual limits. The work is terrifying but necessary for authentic living, for responding to life as it is rather than according to scripts ego has written, for being who you actually are rather than performing who you believe you must be. The ego is your greatest jailer not because it is evil but because it is convincing, not because it is obviously limiting but because it masquerades as liberation, not because it is imposed from outside, but because you have built it yourself and maintain it every moment through choosing continuity over authenticity, consistency over growth, familiar identity over unknown possibility,